The morning the snow would not stop falling, a police officer found a little girl sitting alone beneath the old clock tower, holding a German shepherd with a sign that said, "Please help, my dad is sick." He almost kept walking until he saw her eyes. They were not the eyes of a child waiting for a bus. They were the eyes of someone carrying a whole life on her shoulders. What happened next pulled a dying man back from the edge of winter and changed 3 lives forever. Stay with me, because this is not just a story about a dog or a police officer. This is about love, courage, and the moment a town remembered how to care. Before we begin, tell me where you are watching from and leave your country in the comments. Your place in the world is about to become part of this story. Havenport Ridge did not wake gently in winter. It woke the way an old, proud town woke when it had learned to expect hardship, with its shoulders hunched, its streets hushed, and its breath held tight. Snow fell in thick, steady curtains, turning the downtown bricks and narrow alleys into something softer, almost mythic, like a place built out of paper and powdered sugar. Beautiful until you remembered it could kill you. The clock tower at the center square stood like a stern stone guardian, its face rimmed with frost, its hands moving with the stubborn patience of time that refused to feel sorry for anyone. On mornings like this, the world shrank. Cars moved slowly. Shop signs disappeared behind white drifts. Even the streetlights seemed dimmer, as if they were tired of glowing against so much cold. Officer Elias Monroe had been in Havenport Ridge long enough to recognize the particular silence of a storm that meant business. He was 41, tall and broad-shouldered, with the kind of build that came from years of wearing responsibility the way other men wore coats. His hair was dark, but threaded with early silver at the temples, and his face was rugged, weathered not by vanity but by nights that didn't end on time, and calls that didn't leave the mind when the shift did. His eyes, gray-blue, steady, were the eyes of someone trained to look without flinching, but not trained enough to stop caring. Elias had a habit of speaking softly even when authority would have allowed him to bark. It wasn't weakness. It was something he had learned after a single incident early in his career: a winter crash on a bridge, a child screaming in the back seat, and Elias realizing that volume never saved anyone. Calm did. Since then, he carried his calm like a shield, and when that shield cracked, he hid the fracture with a dry humor that made rookies laugh and made victims breathe easier. Today, he was off duty, technically. The department's dark navy coat still fit him like armor, but he wore it more out of instinct than obligation. He'd told himself he was just walking to clear his head, just circling the square, just letting the storm remind him that the world still had edges. He held a paper cup of coffee that had already gone lukewarm, and he watched snow gather on his gloves like ash from a distant fire. Havenport Ridge's downtown was mostly shuttered this early. A diner sign flickered faintly through the snowfall. A drugstore's windows were fogged from the inside warmth. The only movement came from an elderly man pushing a shovel with grim determination and a stray plastic bag tumbling down the sidewalk like a ghost that couldn't find its grave. Elias turned toward the clock tower steps, thinking he'd head back and let the day be ordinary. Then he saw her. At first, she was just a small shape at the base of the clock tower wall, a dark knot against the white. Too still. Too small. Elias stopped mid-step, the instincts that had saved him more times than he could count, rising like a quiet alarm in his chest. A child alone in this weather wasn't a quirky town moment. It was a warning. He started walking faster, boots crunching through slush. The closer he got, the more the picture sharpened into something that made his throat tighten. A girl, around 10, sat with her knees drawn up. Her body curled inward as if trying to fold herself into less space, so the cold would have less of her to bite. Her coat was thin, a faded green parka with a broken zipper that she held closed with both hands. Snow had collected on her dark hair, melting into wet strands that clung to her cheeks. Her face was pale from the cold, but her eyes were the first thing Elias noticed. Large, hazel, rimmed red, not from wind alone. She had been crying. Pressed against her side was a German shepherd, full-grown, the kind of dog that looked like it had been carved from muscle and discipline. His coat was black and tan, thick enough to carry snow like a mantle. His ears stood erect, and his gaze locked onto Elias with a steady, intelligent watchfulness that made the hair at the back of Elias's neck rise. This wasn't the gaze of a lost pet. It was the gaze of a veteran. The dog sat close to the girl, leaning slightly toward her, body angled like a living barrier between her and the world. Elias slowed his approach, lowering his shoulders, hands visible. He'd worked with K9 units before. He knew how quickly the wrong body language could turn a loyal dog into a storm with teeth. The shepherd's tail was still, not wagging, not stiff in aggression, just still, like a soldier holding a line. Around the dog's neck hung a piece of cardboard tied with twine. The letters were shaky, written with a marker that had probably run out halfway through. "Please help. My dad is sick." Elias's coffee cup suddenly felt ridiculous in his hand, a warm luxury that belonged to another universe. He crouched a few feet away so he wouldn't loom over them. "Hey there," he said, voice gentle, the way he spoke when he didn't want fear to add to pain. "It's freezing. Are you okay?" The girl flinched at the sound of a stranger, then lifted her head. When her eyes met his, Elias felt that familiar internal shift, the one that happened when a call stopped being someone else's problem and became his. She looked older than 10 in the way she held her mouth, in the way she tried to keep her voice steady. She was trying to be brave the way children are brave, by pretending they aren't terrified. The dog's gaze stayed fixed on Elias, unblinking. But he didn't move forward. That restraint, that control, confirmed Elias's suspicion, trained. "I'm Officer Elias Monroe," he said, tapping the badge on his chest lightly so she'd understand. "I'm not here to scare you. I just want to make sure you're safe." The girl swallowed. Her lips were dry, cracked at the corners. I'm okay," she whispered, though her shivering betrayed her. Elias glanced at the cardboard sign again, then back to her face. "That sign," he said softly. "Can you tell me what it means?" She hugged the dog tighter. The shepherd shifted his weight, pressing his shoulder against her like he was lending her courage. Elias noticed the dog's age in the small things, the faint gray around the muzzle, the slight stiffness in the way he settled. Not old, but seasoned. Probably 8 or 9. A dog who had lived a life of commands and purpose. The girl's voice came out thin. "My dad. He's sick," she said. "Really sick." Elias let silence sit for a moment, giving her space to breathe, to choose her words. Snow drifted down between them. Quiet as secrets. "What's your name?" he asked. "Lydia," she said. "Lydia Crowell." Lydia's last name landed in Elias's mind like a bell. Crowell. He had heard it before, years ago, from a case report, a commendation, a story traded among officers the way old soldiers trade legends. "And this is—" Elias nodded toward the dog. Lydia's fingers sank into the thick fur at the dog's neck. "Rook," she whispered, and there was a tenderness in the name that didn't match the harshness of the weather. The dog's ears flicked at the sound, and for the first time his gaze softened slightly, as if he recognized that this stranger knew how to speak without forcing. Elias didn't reach out. Not yet. "Rook's a good dog," he said. "He's staying close to you." Lydia looked down, and a tear slid out despite her effort to hold it back. It froze halfway down her cheek before she wiped it away with the back of her glove. "He always does," she murmured. Elias's chest ached with a slow, rising understanding. He pointed gently at the sign. "Lydia, are you asking for help? Did you come here alone?" Lydia hesitated, eyes flicking toward the empty street as if she feared someone might appear and drag her back into shame. I had to," she said. "If I stayed home, he would try to get up again, and he can't." Elias felt the words settle into him like snow piling on a roof, quietly, steadily, with weight you couldn't ignore forever. "Where is your dad right now?" he asked. Lydia's shoulders tightened. "At home," she said. "He thinks I'm at school." Elias didn't correct her. He knew the truth. School wasn't happening on mornings like this. Not in storms that turned sidewalks into ice. He saw it in her face. The practiced lie. the child's attempt to keep a parent from drowning in guilt. "Does he know you're here?" Elias asked gently. Lydia shook her head quickly, almost panicked. "No. He would be mad. Not at me. At himself." She swallowed hard. "He says he doesn't want anyone to know. He says he failed." Elias's jaw clenched, not at Lydia, but at the cruel pride that kept good people silent until silence became a grave. He exhaled slowly, keeping his voice calm. "Lydia," he said, "you shouldn't be out here in this cold, not alone." Lydia's eyes widened, desperate. "I didn't know what else to do," she whispered. I thought if people saw the sign, maybe someone would help. Maybe someone would—" Her voice broke, and she pressed her face into Rook's fur as if it was the only warm thing left in the world. Rook stayed perfectly still, accepting her sorrow the way a guardian accepts duty. Elias felt a flicker of humor, dark, helpless, at the absurdity of it all. A clock tower looming above them like a judge, a storm falling like a sentence, and a child trying to barter with fate using nothing but a cardboard plea and a loyal dog. The humor didn't make him smile. It just made him more determined. He shifted slightly closer, still careful of Rook's space. "Listen," Elias said, voice steady. "You did the right thing by asking for help. But you don't have to do it like this. Not out here." Lydia lifted her head. Her lashes were wet with snow and tears. "You can't tell him," she said quickly. "Please, he'll feel worse." Elias held her gaze. "I won't do anything to hurt him," he said. "Or you." Rook's eyes stayed on Elias, assessing, like a sentinel deciding whether a stranger's promise had weight. Elias didn't rush. He let the moment breathe. Then he said, "I'm going to help you, but first, I need to make sure you're warm, and I need to see your dad. That's not optional." Lydia's breath caught. Fear and relief wrestled across her face. She looked down at Rook, as if asking him what to do. Rook nudged her hand once, gentle, firm, like a yes spoken without words. Lydia's shoulders sagged with surrender. "Okay," she whispered. Elias stood, extending his gloved hand toward her. Lydia hesitated only a second before placing her small, numb fingers into his. Rook rose smoothly beside her, body aligned with hers, a shadow that refused to leave. Together, under the frost-rimmed face of the clock tower, they stepped away from the place where Lydia had tried to bargain with winter. Elias glanced once at the cardboard sign as the wind lifted it, making it flap softly against Rook's chest like a prayer that hadn't yet found its answer. He didn't know what waited at the end of this walk. He only knew one thing. In a town buried under snow, a child had asked for help, and he had chosen to hear her. Snow had no intention of loosening its grip on Havenport Ridge. If anything, the storm seemed to deepen as Elias Monroe walked with Lydia and Rook through the narrow streets that climbed toward the northern edge of town. The clock tower faded behind them, its stone face swallowed by swirling white until the world shrank to the small triangle of light cast by a single street lamp ahead and the sound of their footsteps pressing into the snow. Lydia's hand felt weightless inside Elias's glove, her fingers so cold they barely registered as human warmth, and he found himself angling his body slightly toward her, not touching, but close enough that the wind broke itself against his coat before it reached her face. Rook walked on Lydia's other side, the great German shepherd moving with a deliberate steadiness that suggested every step had been measured against years of command and instinct, his body always positioned just enough between the child and whatever danger the world might try to slip in. He did not pull at the leash because there was no leash. He did not need one. His loyalty moved him like gravity. They followed North Ashen Road as it curved uphill past old storefronts and silent houses whose windows were blind with frost. The city thinned here, the sidewalks narrowing, the buildings leaning with the fatigue of decades. Snow collected in the hollows of abandoned porches and on mailboxes like small white hats. Elias felt the town watching them in that peculiar winter way, when even empty streets seemed to hold their breath. Lydia said nothing for several minutes. Her breath coming in thin clouds, her eyes fixed on the ground as if afraid that looking ahead would make what she was doing more real. Elias did not press her. Silence, he had learned, was sometimes the kindest language. At last she spoke, so softly that the words almost vanished into the snow. Our house it's old, she said. It used to be yellow. Now it's not really any color. Elias nodded. That's okay, he replied. We'll find it. She gave a small, humorless puff of breath that might have been a laugh in another season. They turned onto a narrower side street where the wind cut harder between the buildings, and the temperature dropped as if winter had claimed this part of town as its home. Lydia stopped in front of a sagging wooden house at the end of the block, its paint peeled down to the bone, its porch listing slightly to the left. A single weak thread of smoke crept from the chimney, not enough to suggest warmth, only effort. This is us, Lydia whispered. Elias felt something sink in his chest. He had seen abandoned houses with more life. He guided Lydia up the steps, which groaned under their weight, and she fumbled with the key, her hands shaking so badly that Elias had to steady the door while she worked the lock. Rook pressed his shoulder gently against her leg as if lending her strength. When the door opened, the cold inside spilled out like a living thing. The house was dim, lit by a single lamp on a crooked table. Blankets were stacked along the wall, thin and worn. A small space heater sat in the corner, unplugged, silent, a relic of warmer hopes. On the couch lay a man. Samuel Crowell, Lydia's father, was in his mid-40s but looked older, his face pale and drawn, the skin around his eyes shadowed by exhaustion. His hair, once probably dark like Lydia's, had gone prematurely gray. He was thin in a way that spoke of sickness, not age, and every breath he took sounded like it scraped against something inside him that did not want to give way. He tried to sit up when he saw Elias, pride moving him faster than his body could follow, and failed, sinking back into the couch with a small, involuntary sound of pain. Dad! Lydia rushed forward, dropping Elias's hand to kneel beside him. I'm okay, she said quickly, the way children do when they know they are not. Samuel's eyes softened at the sight of her, then tightened with shame when he noticed Elias. I told her not to go out, he rasped. His voice was hoarse, as if every word cost him. She shouldn't have, Lydia shook her head. I just wanted to help, she whispered. Rook moved to the couch and rested his massive head on Samuel's knee. The man's trembling hand lifted and found the dog's fur with practiced familiarity, the kind of touch built over years of partnership and trust. Elias stood just inside the doorway, letting his eyes adjust to the gloom. The cold inside the house was not the sharp, clean cold of snow. It was the slow, suffocating cold of months without enough heat. I'm Officer Elias Monroe, he said quietly. I found Lydia at the clock tower. Samuel closed his eyes for a moment, as if the weight of that sentence alone was too heavy. She told you too much, he murmured. She told me enough, Elias replied, not unkindly. He knelt near the couch, careful not to crowd the space. Sir, how long have you been feeling this way? Samuel's breathing hitched. After the fire, he said. Warehouse explosion, chemical smoke. Rook dragged me out. Doctors said my lungs would never be the same. He paused, gathering breath. They retired me. I tried to keep working, couldn't. Then the insurance, then the bills. He gestured weakly at the room. I didn't want her to know. Lydia's shoulders shook. I knew, she whispered. Samuel looked at her, devastation in his eyes. I was trying, he said. I didn't want you to carry this. Elias felt the air thicken with unsaid things. He glanced at Rook, whose ears were low, eyes alert, every inch of him tuned to his handler's pain. How long has the heat been off? Elias asked. Samuel hesitated. A few weeks, he said finally. Elias exhaled slowly. I'm going to make some calls, he said. He stepped aside, dialing one number after another, social services, emergency assistance, veteran support. Each voice on the other end was polite, sympathetic, and ultimately useless. Paperwork, waiting lists, no immediate openings. He ended the last call and stared at his phone, the screen reflecting his own tight expression. When he looked up, Lydia was watching him with wide eyes. Is anyone helping? She asked. Elias forced a small smile. I'm still trying. Samuel's gaze dropped to the floor. "It's all right," he whispered. "They told me the same for months." Lydia's face crumpled. "Dad." Samuel reached for her, pulling her close with what little strength he had. Rook shifted, pressing against both of them, his presence a solid, living wall. Elias watched the scene, something in his chest twisting tighter. He had seen crime, tragedy, grief. But this quiet collapse of a family in the dark, cut deeper. He checked Samuel's pulse when the man dozed, noting the shallow rise and fall of his chest, the bluish tint at his lips. The storm outside grew louder, wind hissing through the cracks of the old windows. Hours passed in a slow, tense vigil. Lydia sat on the floor by the couch, wrapped in 2 blankets, her cheek against Rook's side. Elias stayed, though his shift had long since ended, warming water on the stove, adjusting the useless heater, watching Samuel's breathing like a hawk. Then Rook stiffened. His ears snapped forward, body rigid. A low rumble built in his chest. "Rook," Lydia whispered, sitting up. Elias moved closer to the couch. Samuel's chest rose once, weakly, then stalled. His fingers twitched. His breath came out in a thin, broken wheeze. "Sir," Elias said sharply, "can you hear me?" Samuel's eyes fluttered, unfocused, then rolled back. "Dad," Lydia cried. Rook barked, loud and urgent, nudging Samuel's arm, circling, every instinct screaming that something was wrong. Elias's heart slammed against his ribs. He checked the pulse again, rapid, thready, slipping. "He's in trouble," Elias said, already reaching for his phone. "Lydia, get your coat." She obeyed instantly, tears streaming. Rook planted himself at Samuel's side, barking again, as if daring death to take another step. Elias dialed 911, his voice steady, despite the panic surging through him. "Medical emergency," he said. "Severe respiratory distress. We need an ambulance now." The operator's questions blurred together. Elias answered them automatically, his focus never leaving Samuel's face. Outside, the wind howled like an animal. Rook's barking filled the house, not in anger, but in command. "Good boy," Elias whispered, one hand pressed to the dog's broad side. "You saved him. Stay with us." Sirens cut through the storm at last, a sound like a lifeline. Elias opened the door as paramedics burst in, snow clinging to their coats. They moved fast, efficient, oxygen mask on, stretcher ready. Lydia clung to Elias's arm as they lifted Samuel. Rook followed, refusing to be left behind, his body tense with purpose. As they hurried out into the snow, Havenport Ridge seemed to hold its breath, the storm swirling around the small procession of hope and fear moving down the street toward the waiting ambulance. The ambulance carved its way through Havenport Ridge like a red and white blade, siren howling against the storm. Snow whipped across the windshield in thick waves, each flake another obstacle in the race between breath and silence. Inside the ambulance, the world shrank to the tight circle of light over Samuel Crowell's face, pale and slick with sweat, his chest rising in shallow, uneven pulls beneath the oxygen mask. Each breath looked borrowed, temporary, as if the air itself had begun to hesitate. Officer Elias Monroe sat opposite the stretcher, knees braced, one hand gripping the rail, the other steadying Lydia as she trembled beside her father. She was very small in that space, her knees pulled to her chest, her coat swallowed by blankets the medics had wrapped around her. Her eyes never left her father's face. They were the eyes of someone standing at the edge of a cliff, too young to understand the depth but old enough to know what falling meant. The lead medic, Tom Alvarez, a compact man in his mid-40s with deep lines etched around his eyes, and the calm of someone who had negotiated with death more times than he cared to count, adjusted the IV with efficient hands. His partner, Megan Holloway, younger, tall and athletic with her dark hair tied tight at the nape of her neck, monitored the heart rate on the screen, calling out numbers in a steady voice that cut through the chaos. Neither of them wasted words. This was a language they had learned the hard way. "Pulse is weak," Megan said. "Breathing's shallow," Tom replied. Elias leaned forward. He's been without proper heat and medication for weeks. Tom's eyes flicked up, something like anger passing through them. That'll do it. Lydia's fingers curled into the edge of Elias's coat. Is he dying? She whispered, her voice cracking on the word. Elias did not hesitate. He met her gaze squarely, the way he had learned to do when lies would only make the fall worse. He's in danger, he said, but he's not alone. We're getting him help. She nodded, swallowing, and pressed her forehead against the stretcher rail, as if that alone could keep her father tethered to the world. The ambulance skidded into the emergency bay at St. Brenton Hospital, snow swirling around the doors as they burst open. Bright light poured in, blinding after the dim cold of the house. Nurses and doctors descended on the stretcher, voices overlapping, hands moving, equipment rolling. Elias lifted Lydia without thinking, carrying her through the sliding doors as the storm was shut out behind them. Inside, the hospital was another world, warm, humming, sharp with antiseptic and urgency. Samuel disappeared through the double doors marked ER, and Lydia's small body went rigid in Elias's arms. He set her down on a chair in the waiting area. She clutched his sleeve with both hands, her knuckles white. Minutes stretched into something heavier. Rook was not allowed inside the ambulance, but Elias had brought him in the patrol car that followed. Now the great German shepherd lay at Lydia's feet, curled tightly, his chin resting on her boot, eyes fixed on the red letters glowing above the emergency room doors. He did not whine. He did not move. He guarded. A doctor emerged at last, a woman in her late 50s with silver hair pulled into a low bun, her face lined by long hours and difficult truths. Dr. Elaine Porter introduced herself quietly. He's stable for the moment, she said. Lydia leapt up. Can I see him? Dr. Porter shook her head gently. Not yet. He's on oxygen. We're running tests. You got him here just in time. The words just in time fell like snowmelt on frozen ground. Elias felt his shoulders sag with a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. When Dr. Porter left, Lydia sank back into the chair, burying her face in Rook's fur. The dog shifted, wrapping his body closer around her legs, a living wall against the world. Elias stood a few steps away, hands in his pockets, staring at the tiled floor. He had seen emergencies before, had walked away from scenes that would haunt other men. But this family, this child who had tried to bargain with winter, it lodged somewhere deeper. He pulled out his phone and began making calls. The hospital administrator's office, the veteran support line, the K9 association he had once trained alongside. Every number he could think of. He explained again and again, stripping the story of names, keeping the dignity intact, but not the urgency. This can't wait, he said into the receiver for the third time. He's a former K9 officer, lung damage from a warehouse explosion. His daughter's 9. Their house has no heat. He'll die if he goes back to that cold. Some calls ended with apologies, some with promises to call back. One from a local veterans outreach coordinator named Harold Jenkins, an older man with a gravelly voice and a heart that still beat for the badge, ended with something different. I know some people, Harold said. Let me work. Elias exhaled. Thank you. Hours later, Dr. Porter returned. He's still critical, she said. He needs continued oxygen therapy and medication. The costs? I'll make sure they're covered, Elias said before she could finish. Dr. Porter studied him, reading the lines on his face. That's not a small promise, officer. Elias held her gaze. I know. Lydia looked up at him, eyes wide. What does that mean? Elias knelt in front of her. It means your dad needs help now, and he's going to get it. Tears slid down her cheeks. She threw her arms around his neck. Rook rose and pressed his head against Elias's shoulder, a low, steady sound in his chest that might have been approval. Morning crept in through the high windows of the waiting area, pale and cautious. Lydia had fallen asleep against Rook, her small hand twisted in his collar. Elias had not slept. His phone buzzed again. Harold's voice, brighter now. We've started something. Veterans groups, K9 handlers, a couple of reporters. Donations are coming in. Enough to cover the hospital for now. Enough to fix the heater. Elias closed his eyes. You did this overnight? Harold chuckled. When people hear about a man who ran into fire and a dog who dragged him out, they don't stay quiet. A nurse appeared at the door. Mr. Crowell is awake, she said. Lydia jolted upright. Daddy? They moved together, Elias hanging back as Lydia rushed to her father's bedside. Samuel looked frail, but his eyes were open, and when he saw his daughter, something like light returned to his face. Rook placed his paws against the bed, tail finally thumping once, as if the world had tilted back into alignment. Samuel's voice was thin. Hey, kid. Lydia climbed carefully onto the edge of the bed, pressing her forehead to his. You scared me. He smiled faintly. I'm sorry. Elias stood at the door. Samuel's gaze found him. Officer. Thank you. Elias shook his head. You don't owe me anything. Samuel's eyes glistened. You didn't walk away. Elias felt the weight of that truth settle over him. Outside the window, Havenport Ridge still lay under snow, but inside the hospital, something had shifted. The night that would not end had finally begun to loosen its grip. The storm finally broke over Havenport Ridge just after sunrise, as if winter itself had grown tired of pressing its weight upon the world. Snow still clung to rooftops and sidewalks, but the wind softened, and for the first time in days, the sky allowed a thin blade of pale light to slip through the clouds. From the window of St. Brenton Hospital, the town looked like a sleeping creature, its scars covered in white. Officer Elias Monroe stood near the glass, his reflection pale against the morning. He had not slept. His coat still smelled faintly of snow and smoke from the Crowell house, and his shoulders ached with a fatigue that was not physical. It was the ache of having stood between a child and the void, and realizing that the work did not end simply because the worst had passed. Behind him, in the small recovery room, Samuel Crowell lay propped against pillows, a clear oxygen line resting beneath his nose, the quiet hiss of the machine marking each fragile victory of breath. His face was still hollow, but color had returned to his cheeks. Lydia, wrapped in a borrowed sweater that hung from her shoulders like someone else's coat of hope, sat at his side, her hands folded tightly in her lap as though afraid the world might slip away if she let go. On the floor beside her, Rook lay stretched across the tiles, his massive head resting on his paws, eyes open, watchful, as if this small square of space was now his post for eternity. Samuel lifted his hand weakly. Officer, he said, his voice thin but steady. Elias turned from the window and stepped closer. How are you feeling? Samuel gave a half-smile. Like I was pulled out of a river I didn't realize I was drowning in. Lydia looked up at her father, tears shining. You scared me, she said. Samuel reached for her hand. I'm sorry, sweetheart. I didn't mean to. Elias watched the exchange, feeling the quiet gravity of the moment. This was not a man who had lost a battle. This was a man who had survived one. Dr. Elaine Porter entered the room with a chart tucked under her arm, her silver hair still immaculate despite the long night. She greeted Elias with a nod. He's responding to treatment better than we expected. It's still going to be a long road, but he's past the edge. Samuel closed his eyes briefly. Thank you, Doctor. Dr. Porter's gaze shifted to Elias. Someone has already arranged coverage for the immediate costs, she said carefully. Samuel frowned. What does that mean? Elias met his eyes. It means you don't have to worry about this right now. Samuel's jaw tightened. I didn't ask for charity. Elias did not flinch. This isn't charity, he said. It's people remembering who you are. Samuel looked away, shame flickering across his face. Later, when Lydia had stepped into the hallway with a nurse to get breakfast, Samuel turned to Elias. She shouldn't have been out there, he said. Selling nothing, begging. Elias shook his head. She wasn't begging. She was protecting you. Samuel swallowed. I was supposed to protect her. You still are, Elias replied. The words settled between them like something solid and necessary. By noon, the hospital corridors filled with the muted rhythm of ordinary life returning. Volunteers arrived with bags of donated clothes for Lydia. A social worker named Carla Nguyen, petite, warm-eyed and relentless in her optimism, explained the steps ahead: temporary housing assistance, long-term medical planning, community resources. Samuel listened, exhausted but attentive. Elias lingered, though he had every reason to leave. Instead, he made more calls. The repair company that would fix the Crowell's heater that afternoon. The school administrator who would ensure Lydia returned without stigma or questions. The local paper that had already printed the story without names, letting the town's conscience do the rest. By evening, Lydia stood by the hospital window with Rook at her side, watching the sun dissolve behind the snow-laced rooftops. "He's going to be okay," she whispered, more to herself than to anyone else. Elias knelt beside her. "He is." She studied his face. "Why are you doing all this?" Elias smiled faintly. "Because someone once stayed for me when I didn't think anyone would." That night, Samuel slept deeply for the first time in months. Outside, Havenport Ridge glowed under the soft hush of snow, no longer menacing, only still. By the time the snowstorm loosened its grip on Havenport Ridge, something else had begun to gather. Quietly at first, then with unstoppable weight. It was not snow, it was people. The story reached the town the way all true stories do, carried by voices, whispered across counters, repeated in hallways, folded into phone calls made late at night. A former K-9 officer with ruined lungs. A child who sat beneath the clock tower with a cardboard plea. A dog who refused to abandon his partner. And a police officer who chose to stay. Within 2 days, the Crowell family's name was no longer alone in the dark. Elias Monroe watched it happen from the edge, uncomfortable with the attention but grateful for its force. Veterans groups called first, old men with voices like gravel and hearts still shaped like badges. Then the K-9 associations. Then church leaders, union reps, a local radio host who opened his morning show with the sentence, "Somebody in Havenport Ridge needs us." By noon, the fundraiser link, set up by Harold Jenkins and shared by Carla Nguyen, was everywhere. At St. Brenton Hospital, Lydia began receiving drawings from strangers. Crayons and construction paper, sons and dogs and stick figures that always smiled. She taped them to the wall beside Samuel's bed until the sterile room looked like it belonged to a child again. Samuel, pale but stronger each day, watched the parade of support with a mixture of awe and embarrassment. "I didn't do anything to deserve this," he said one afternoon as Elias stood by the window, phone pressed to his ear, confirming the heater installation time. "You ran into fire," Elias replied. "Twice." Samuel shook his head weakly. "That was my job." Elias finally turned to him. "So is this." The heater was fixed that same evening. A local electrician named Mark Holloway, Megan's older brother, broad, red-bearded, permanently smudged with grease, installed it himself and refused payment. "Tell Samuel I owed him from back in '09, he muttered. Groceries arrived next, blankets, winter coats, a small desk for Lydia's room, a stack of books from the school librarian, Janice Whitmore, a tall, gentle woman with silver glasses who smelled faintly of vanilla and paper. "She shouldn't fall behind," Janice said. "Not after all this." When Samuel was discharged a week later, Havenport Ridge did something it hadn't done in a long time. It held its breath together. Elias drove them home in his patrol car. Lydia sat in the back seat with Rook's head in her lap. Fingers buried in his fur as if afraid the world might steal him away if she let go. The house on North Ashen Road looked different now. Not new, not perfect, but alive. Smoke curled from the chimney in real, confident spirals. The windows glowed amber. The front step had been fixed. Inside, warmth greeted them like an old friend. Samuel stood in the doorway longer than necessary, eyes glassy. "It's warm," he whispered. Lydia laughed, a sound Elias had not heard before, high and sudden. Rook trotted from room to room, sniffing, tail wagging once, approving the transformation. The months that followed moved slowly and all at once. Winter surrendered to spring, spring to early summer. Samuel's lungs healed in stubborn increments. Oxygen became a tool instead of a lifeline. Lydia returned to school full-time, her teachers careful, her classmates curious. Rook resumed his ancient routines: perimeter checks, window watches, bedtime patrols. Elias visited every Sunday. Sometimes he brought groceries, sometimes new books. Once, a used bicycle he'd found online and repaired himself. Lydia named it Snowstorm and rode it in circles until she collapsed laughing in the grass. Samuel grew stronger. He began walking without assistance, then without oxygen for short stretches. The fundraiser covered medical costs and more, enough to keep the house safe, the lights on, the pantry full. One evening, near the end of summer, Samuel sat on the porch with Elias, watching Lydia and Rook chase fireflies across the yard. "I almost lost everything," Samuel said quietly. "Not just my life, my daughter, my purpose." Elias nodded. "But you didn't." Samuel's gaze rested on Rook. "Because of him." "And her," Elias added. Samuel smiled. "And you." Silence settled, gentle and full. Weeks later, Samuel asked Elias to stay for dinner. The house smelled of soup and bread. Lydia insisted Elias sit at the head of the table, because heroes sit there. Afterward, Samuel cleared his throat. "Officer Monroe, I need to ask you something." Rook rose from the rug and stepped beside Samuel, placing a paw on his knee. "I want you to take him," Samuel said. "Rook, he saved my life, but you saved our future." Elias froze. He knelt in front of Rook, fingers sinking into the familiar fur. "No," he said softly. "His place is here." Rook leaned into Elias's touch, then turned and nudged Lydia's hand with his nose. Lydia wrapped her arms around Rook's neck. "He's our family," she whispered. "But you are too." Elias felt the words settle into him like something permanent. That night, Lydia handed him a folded drawing. 4 figures, 1 son, 1 dog, all standing together. Written at the top, "You didn't save our winter. You saved our life." And for the first time in years, Havenport Ridge slept without fear of the cold. By the time the snowstorm loosened its grip on Havenport Ridge, something else had begun to gather. Quietly at first, then with unstoppable weight. It was not snow, it was people. The story reached the town the way all true stories do, carried by voices, whispered across counters, repeated in hallways, folded into phone calls made late at night. A former K-9 officer with ruined lungs. A child who sat beneath the clock tower with a cardboard plea. A dog who refused to abandon his partner. And a police officer who chose to stay. Within 2 days, the Crowell family's name was no longer alone in the dark. Elias Monroe watched it happen from the edge, uncomfortable with the attention but grateful for its force. Veterans groups called first, old men with voices like gravel and hearts still shaped like badges. Then the K-9 associations. Then church leaders, union reps, a local radio host who opened his morning show with the sentence, "Somebody in Havenport Ridge needs us." By noon, the fundraiser link, set up by Harold Jenkins and shared by Carla Nguyen, was everywhere. At St. Brenton Hospital, Lydia began receiving drawings from strangers. Crayons and construction paper, sons and dogs and stick figures that always smiled. She taped them to the wall beside Samuel's bed until the sterile room looked like it belonged to a child again. Samuel, pale but stronger each day, watched the parade of support with a mixture of awe and embarrassment. "I didn't do anything to deserve this," he said one afternoon, as Elias stood by the window, phone pressed to his ear, confirming the heater installation time. "You ran into fire," Elias replied. "Twice." Samuel shook his head weakly. "That was my job." Elias finally turned to him. "So is this." The heater was fixed that same evening. A local electrician named Mark Holloway, Megan's older brother, broad, red-bearded, permanently smudged with grease, installed it himself and refused payment. "Tell Samuel I owed him from back in '09, he muttered. Groceries arrived next. Blankets, winter coats. A small desk for Lydia's room. A stack of books from the school librarian, Janice Whitmore, a tall, gentle woman with silver glasses who smelled faintly of vanilla and paper. "She shouldn't fall behind," Janice said. "Not after all this." When Samuel was discharged a week later, Havenport Ridge did something it hadn't done in a long time. It held its breath together. Elias drove them home in his patrol car. Lydia sat in the back seat with Rook's head in her lap, fingers buried in his fur, as if afraid the world might steal him away if she let go. The house on North Ashen Road looked different now. Not new, not perfect, but alive. Smoke curled from the chimney in real, confident spirals. The windows glowed amber. The front step had been fixed. Inside, warmth greeted them like an old friend. Samuel stood in the doorway longer than necessary, eyes glassy. "It's warm," he whispered. Lydia laughed, a sound Elias had not heard before, high and sudden. Rook trotted from room to room, sniffing, tail wagging once, approving the transformation. The months that followed moved slowly, and all at once. Winter surrendered to spring, spring to early summer. Samuel's lungs healed in stubborn increments. Oxygen became a tool instead of a lifeline. Lydia returned to school full-time, her teachers careful, her classmates curious. Rook resumed his ancient routines: perimeter checks, window watches, bedtime patrols. Elias visited every Sunday. Sometimes he brought groceries, sometimes new books. Once a used bicycle he'd found online and repaired himself. Lydia named it Snowstorm and rode it in circles until she collapsed laughing in the grass. Samuel grew stronger. He began walking without assistance, then without oxygen for short stretches. The fundraiser covered medical costs and more, enough to keep the house safe, the lights on, the pantry full. One evening, near the end of summer, Samuel sat on the porch with Elias, watching Lydia and Rook chase fireflies across the yard. "I almost lost everything," Samuel said quietly. "Not just my life, my daughter, my purpose." Elias nodded. "But you didn't." Samuel's gaze rested on Rook. "Because of him." "And her," Elias added. Samuel smiled. "And you." Silence settled, gentle and full. Weeks later, Samuel asked Elias to stay for dinner. The house smelled of soup and bread. Lydia insisted Elias sit at the head of the table because heroes sit there. Afterward, Samuel cleared his throat. "Officer Monroe, I need to ask you something." Rook rose from the rug and stepped beside Samuel, placing a paw on his knee. "I want you to take him," Samuel said. "Rook, he saved my life, but you saved our future." Elias froze. He knelt in front of Rook, fingers sinking into the familiar fur. "No," he said softly. "His place is here." Rook leaned into Elias's touch, then turned and nudged Lydia's hand with his nose. Lydia wrapped her arms around Rook's neck. "He's our family," she whispered. "But you are too." Elias felt the words settle into him like something permanent. That night, Lydia handed him a folded drawing, 4 figures. 1 son, 1 dog, all standing together. Written at the top, "You didn't save our winter. You saved our life." And for the first time in years, Havenport Ridge slept without fear of the cold. Autumn arrived in Havenport Ridge as quietly as a prayer. The mountains loosened their last grip of snow, and the valley filled with amber light that poured across the town like forgiveness. Trees along North Ashen Road wore crowns of copper and gold. The wind carried the scent of pine and distant wood smoke, and for the first time in nearly a year, the world no longer felt like it was holding its breath. The Crowell house stood open to the sun. Warmth lived inside its walls now. Real warmth. The kind that did not flicker or threaten to disappear in the night. The windows were clean, the curtains new. A photograph of Lydia and Rook taken outside the hospital was framed on the mantel beside a more recent one of Samuel standing in the yard without his oxygen tank, smiling like a man who had finally made peace with the idea of tomorrow. Samuel Crowell leaned against the porch railing, a mug of coffee steaming in his hands. His posture was steadier now, his shoulders broader, his breathing slow and deep. The oxygen tank still waited beside the chair inside, but it was no longer his lifeline. His lungs were healing the way only stubborn men heal, inch by inch, refusing to surrender. In the grass below the porch, Lydia ran barefoot through the fallen leaves, her laughter ringing clear and bright. Rook followed at her side, the great German shepherd moving with graceful patience, his black and tan coat glowing in the afternoon light. He had slowed a little with age, but his eyes still carried the same fierce devotion. Wherever Lydia went, he went. Wherever Samuel stood, Rook placed himself between him and the world. At the edge of the gravel drive, Officer Elias Monroe watched them. He had come every Sunday since spring, sometimes with groceries, sometimes with books for Lydia, sometimes with nothing at all except his quiet presence. He never announced himself. He simply appeared, like the steady return of something good. Lydia saw him and ran. She crashed into him with the full force of a child who had learned the language of safety. Elias laughed and caught her easily, lifting her from the ground as she wrapped her arms around his neck. "You came," she said, breathless. "I always come on Sundays," Elias replied. Rook trotted behind her, stopped in front of Elias, sat squarely, and lifted one massive paw onto his knee with solemn authority. The dog's tail thumped once in the grass. Samuel laughed from the porch. "That is his greeting now. You taught him that." Elias knelt and placed his forehead briefly against Rook's. "No, I did not. He taught me." Inside the house, the afternoon unfolded in quiet rituals. Coffee poured, bread broken. Lydia insisted Elias take the chair at the head of the table because heroes sit there. Samuel pretended to protest but smiled too hard to make it convincing. Rook lay at their feet, head on his paws, eyes closed but never truly asleep. After the dishes were done, Samuel asked Elias to step outside with him. They stood on the porch watching Lydia teach Rook to balance a fallen leaf on his nose. The dog complied with saintly patience. "I used to think strength meant handling everything alone," Samuel said quietly. He stared at the distant hills. "I thought asking for help meant failure." Elias leaned against the railing beside him. "And now?" "Now I know better," Samuel said. "That night you stayed. When you had every reason to walk away. You saved more than my life. You saved the future of this house." Elias swallowed. Samuel reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded document. He opened it carefully. Honorary family member, Elias Monroe. The words were simple, the frame plain, but the meaning weighed more than any medal. Lydia came running. "What is it?" Samuel held it out. "That is for him." She read it slowly, then threw her arms around Elias. "That means you belong to us forever." Elias's voice caught. "I am not going anywhere," Rook barked once in agreement. As evening settled, the three of them walked to the hill behind the house. The town stretched below them, glowing gold in the dying sun. The old clock tower stood in the distance, small now, no longer a place of desperation but a quiet witness to everything they had survived. "That is where you found me," Lydia said. "Yes," Elias answered. "That is where winter lost," Lydia said. Rook sat at her side, chest proud, ears high, guarding the moment. The sun slipped behind the mountains. The first stars appeared. No sirens, no storms, only quiet. Elias looked at them and understood something that would stay with him for the rest of his life. He had not just helped them survive the winter. They had taught him how to live after it. They stood together until the sky darkened and the world finally rested. This story reminds us that sometimes the greatest miracles do not come with thunder or fire from the sky. They come in the form of a child who refuses to give up, a dog who refuses to leave, and a stranger who chooses to stay. God often works through ordinary people, through quiet courage, through open hands, through hearts that refuse to close, even when the world feels cold. In our daily lives, we all face moments where winter seems endless, moments where the road feels too heavy and hope feels too far. But this story teaches us that when we trust God and keep walking forward, even the longest winter can learn to let go. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment below and tell us what this story meant to you. Subscribe to the channel so more stories of light can reach those still in the dark. May God bless you and your family. May He protect your home. May He fill your heart with peace and strength. And may every storm in your life be followed by a new beginning. If you believe in this message, please comment. Amen.